Time for another new file. I'll rename app.ts here to union aliases.ts and add a new app.ts file where we can start from scratch again, close the other file. And now in here, I want to dive a bit deeper into functions. Now, of course, we already worked with functions. For example, here in the union aliases file with the combine function. And for example, you saw that for functions, you can assign types to the parameters of functions. Well, turns out there's a bit more you can do with functions and types. For that, I'll recreate my add function, which simply accepts numbers, not strings, which does one simple thing. It returns n1 plus n2. So not too tricky. Now, as I mentioned, we can assign types to parameters. That's not new. The function overall, however, has one important other type. It has a return type. And here the return type is inferred by TypeScript. We can see it if we hover over add. Here at the end, the colon after the parameter list, this here describes the return type of the function. So the type of the returned value. Here I return the addition of n1 and n2, and since both these inputs are numbers, TypeScript is able to infer that the result of this will be a number, and since we return it, that the return type of this function therefore will be a number. If we would concatenate them as strings here, with toString for example, then TypeScript would correctly infer that we return a string here. Now, of course, we can also explicitly assign a return type here by adding a colon after the parameter list and then the type you want to return, like number. This would be the same type as inferred. If I, for example, set this to string, I would get an error here because obviously my calculation here does not match my described return type. Now, just as with variables, it's a good idea to let TypeScript do its job regarding type inference. And if you have no specific reason for explicitly setting the type, you should therefore not set the type and instead let TypeScript infer the type. Regarding the return types though, there is one interesting type which we haven't seen before and which might be brand new to you if you have no experience with other programming languages, because it is a type that doesn't really exist in JavaScript. It's the void type. Let's say we have the print result method. There we get a number argument, which should be a number. And in there, I want to console log num, and I want to console log it as part of a string where I say result plus num. So now this will be concatenated to one long string and will be output. And now I can call print result and, for example, pass to that the result of my add function call with 5 plus, let's say, 12. So I'm executing add here with two numbers, and the result of that, so what add returns, is then passed as an argument into print result, and that should print it to the console. If we now compile this and then have a look at that in our page or on our page here, we see result 17, which makes sense. Now the interesting thing here is the return type of print result. What would you guess is the return type here? So maybe you think it's string because I'm creating a string in here, but keep in mind we're not returning this. We're not returning anything here. And therefore this print result function here has a special return type, void. Now you might know this void return type from other programming languages. There you have something like this. JavaScript doesn't really know that or doesn't really have a name for this situation. TypeScript, however, does. So indeed, this function here has a return type of void. And of course, you don't need to specify it here. TypeScript's inference did its job. But I want to make it really clear that this has the void return type, which is why I am adding it here for demo purposes. Now, void really just means this function doesn't have a return statement. It doesn't return anything. It successfully completes, it does its job, it executes its code, it does not yield an error or anything like that, but it then does not return anything. That's the void return type. Now, technically in JavaScript, of course, if we would console log the result of print result here, and I now compile this and we see what gets output here on the page, we see that undefined is returned by that. So technically, and that's really interesting, in JavaScript, if we use the return value of a function that doesn't return anything, we get undefined as a value. And as you probably know, undefined in JavaScript is actually a real value. A value you, for example, also get if you try to access a property on an object which doesn't exist. So here we get void, even though technically this returns undefined. And now to make it even more confusing, undefined actually is a type in TypeScript. You can have undefined as a type, and for example, a brand new variable, some value, can receive undefined as a type, and you will not get an error. This variable will now just be forever undefined. How useful that might be is a different question, but undefined is a valid type in TypeScript. Nonetheless, here you see we're getting an error. And we're getting an error because a function is not allowed to return undefined. Technically, it of course does, but TypeScript thinks about functions a bit differently. You should use void here if a function returns nothing and not undefined, because with void you make clear that this function deliberately does not have a return statement. If you would say undefined here, then TypeScript would expect that you have a return statement where you just don't return a value. That's the technical difference. Now you see I'm not getting an error. From a JavaScript perspective, this is basically the same as this, but TypeScript makes a differentiation here, and therefore void is the type you want to use if you don't have a return statement. Undefined, which you will rarely need to be honest, can be used if you return without returning an actual value. But again, this is a rare use case, and you could use void with a return statement like this as well. You would not get an error, and by default you would actually also use void in this scenario, unless you really have a function that should produce undefined and you want to be clear about that. But again, that will rarely be the case. I just want to make sure here that you understand the difference between void and undefined, that void is the standard which you'll use in pretty much all scenarios where you have a function that does not return a value, and that you can assign it explicitly, but of course TypeScript also is able to infer it, like it would be able here as well. I just added this for demo purposes here.